Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Allie Gold-Roberts from Ceres. I am thrilled to welcome you to a webinar that we're organizing with our colleagues and partners at our Transportation Future. This webinar is titled Transportation and Climate Initiative, Opportunities for Improving Public Health Equity and Investing in Clean Transportation. For those of you who are joining us via phone or audio, if you're having any audio issues, please feel free to ask for assistance in the chat function, and we will gladly support you in getting all set up. And I just want to thank our colleagues at Maine Conservation Voters and the Union of Concerned Scientists in partnering with us on today's webinar. And with that, let me go through our agenda and welcome our speakers, and we'll get started. Next slide, please. Great, so this is just a little housekeeping. Oh, sorry, Dave, we'll go back to that Q&A slide, just especially since it's only 1:01 and I see lots of people logging in as we speak. So I'll slow down the welcomes while folks are logging in. So if you have a question during the webinar, please feel free to type into the little question section or flag the raise your hand section, and we will gladly help you. You're welcome to type in questions at any point. We'll save them for each speaker at the end of each section, and then also do Q&A at the end. So hopefully we'll have opportunity for multiple question and answer sessions. But then also, if for some reason we don't get to all of the questions, we will be sure to follow up with you if you have specific questions. I also always get the question, will you get the slides and will there be a recording? So I'll tell you now, yes and yes. So if you have any questions about that, we will make sure you have all of the details, and this will likely sit on the Our Transportation Future website as well as a resource for folks to go back to. So with that, we will jump right in. Next slide. So our agenda for today is we're going to do some introductions. I'll just give some bios of our featured speakers. Then we'll talk a little bit about what the Transportation and Climate Initiative is, and Kathleen Meal and John Carlson, both from Maine Conservation Voters and Ceres, will walk through some of the kind of technical pieces and where the advocacy community has been involved. And then we'll get to our expert speakers, both learning about kind of the state's progress in developing TCI, hearing specifically from Virginia as one of the states that's been involved in that process, and then learning about the public health benefits from Dr. Nilu Tumala. So, and then we'll go into Q&A. So next slide. Here you get to see all of our pictures, and you'll get to see our little bobbing heads above. So I'll just give bios for our two special speakers. First is Matt Strickler. He is the Secretary of Natural Resources for the Commonwealth of Virginia, and he's been serving in that post since January 2018. Prior to joining the Northam administration, he served as Senior Policy Advisor to Democratic members of the House of Representatives Committee on Natural Resources. He's originally from Lexington, Virginia, and graduated from Washington and Lee University, and holds a master's degree in Public Policy and Marine Science from the College of William & Mary and the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. And Dr. Nilu Tumala is a physician and clinical assistant professor of surgery at George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences. She completed medical school at Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine and residency at Wake Forest University Baptist Medical Center. She has a special interest in advocacy concerning the health effects of climate change and has been actively involved with providing medical education as well as giving public testimony on the issue. She is a trained climate reality leader and works with the American Lung Association, Virginia Clinicians for Climate Action, the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, and Environment Virginia as a volunteer activist and educator. Two very qualified speakers to speak to TCI and the incredible potential public health benefits of climate action. So with that, we'll jump to the next slide. And it is my pleasure to kick it over to John Carlson and Kathleen Meal to walk through just a quick orientation on what is the Transportation Climate Initiative to help level set everyone and make sure we're all using the same vocabulary and we can use that TCI acronym freely then I think the rest of the webinar. So John and Kathleen, I'll leave it to you.
Great, thanks so much, Allie. So the Transportation Climate Initiative can refer to several things, but most immediately is a group of a dozen states that started working together to try to address the climate problems that come from our transportation sector. They're working under the auspices of the Georgetown Climate Center and have been having different conversations and workshops around this topic since 2010. More recently, though, they started focusing on creating an actual specific policy that all the states would be able to join to try to address what's really a regional problem. And that's because the emission sources in transportation are mobile and the emissions also travel across straight lines, it really does take kind of a regional approach to tackle this problem. And luckily, there are some familiar models that they could refer to inspire them as they try to create a program. There was an acid rain program from the 90s that reduced sulfur dioxide from power plants. And most applicably, there's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which work to reduce carbon dioxide emissions from power plants. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But based on this idea that there would be some type of cap and invest market-based system that could help us solve the problem of transportation emissions, they started working heavily in December of 2018. They had spent earlier in 2018 conducting listening sessions throughout the region, and then in December announced that they would spend 2019 developing an actual specific proposal. During 2019, as they were working on this process, they held stakeholder workshops to get detailed input on the structure of the program. There were workshops held in Newark, New Jersey, in Baltimore, Maryland, and Boston. There's also a public comment forum where online stakeholders could submit comments. There were various webinars and specific questions that were used to structure some of those, but we eventually had over 8,000 comments submitted to that public comment forum, and over 90% of them were strongly positive. So with that as kind of the background to the process of how we got here, you know, I do want to again highlight why transportation is such a key thing for us to be working on. This is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the region. It's bigger than the electric sector, and unlike the electric sector, the emissions right now are continuing to rise. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, not only are emissions continuing to rise from the transportation sector, a very large part of those emissions are coming from passenger vehicles and trucks. So we really need to think about it systemically in order to tackle this. These aren't single point sources of emissions where you can regulate an individual power plant. We need to figure out how to transform the entire system. Next slide, please. And here you can see, you know, some of the effects that this is having on us. We have some of the highest concentrations of co-pollutants and emissions from transportation along the East Coast in the TCI region. The specific stats here were collected, I believe, by the New York Times several months ago. It's very up to date, but not only are emissions rising, but in most of the region, they're rising per person. And so it's a real issue that we need to figure out how to change the trajectory. And next slide, please, and I'll pass it to Kathleen.
Thanks, John, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So TCI is a regional cap and invest program that's designed to reduce carbon emissions and address the increasing threat of climate change. As John said, it's modeled on the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which would require fuel wholesalers to purchase allowances for the carbon content of their on-road diesel and gasoline sales. The way it works is there's a cap or a limit on the allowances that are available at auction, and that cap would decline over time. So the revenues that would be generated from the auctions would then be funneled to states. to invest in clean transportation. And the states will have a lot of latitude in those investment decisions, including the potential to dedicate revenue to key municipal infrastructure investments. And we'll talk about those possibilities in just a minute, but first, a little bit more on the program that makes so many of us so optimistic about TCI. Next slide, please. So the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is also a regional cap and invest program. It was designed to reduce carbon emissions from the power sector, and we have more than a decade of experience and data that demonstrates its success. Emissions from the power plants covered by RGGI are down 47%, which outpaces the rest of the nation by 90%. Allowance auctions have generated $3.3 billion in revenue, which states have invested according to their own formulas. In Maine, for example, we invest RGGI revenue in the Efficiency Maine Trust, which runs our energy efficiency programs and offers consumer incentives for everything from high efficiency appliances like heat pumps and heat pump water heaters to weatherization upgrades that make our very, very old housing stock more comfortable and cost effective to maintain. That means that Maine people spend less money heating their homes, and that really creates a ripple effect throughout the economy. And we're not the only RGGI state that's reaping those kinds of economic benefits. The gross domestic product of RGGI states, all in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic regions, has grown by 47% under the program. That outpaces the rest of the country, where GDP only grew by 31%. And John, I'll kick it back to you.
Thanks, Kathleen. Next slide, please. So I do want to highlight some of the benefits of a cap and invest model, why the states decided to use this as their attempt to influence the transportation sector, or at least one piece of the puzzle. And so one of the benefits is that the market dynamically determines the price of allowance. It means in an economic recession, the price will tend to go lower, and in times of great growth, it'll tend to go higher. We've learned a lot from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and various cap and invest programs that have been tried elsewhere. And so the states are looking at a slew of structures that'll kind of put guardrails around the program so that both it adjusts so that it doesn't overly burden any economy, but also that we are achieving the emissions reductions that the program is designed to achieve. There are ways of cost containment reserves and emission reduction reserves where the allowances that are available on the trading market can be expanded or reduced. There's going to be flexibility in the compliance period for the different regulated entities. There's a lot of like nuts and bolts that the states are looking at to make sure that this works incredibly well. Now, obviously, the last several months have seen a great deal of upheaval in the economy and how transportation is functioning. And I think it's been heartening to see that most of the ideas that the states have been already looking at would adapt well to this current situation. Now, we know that the states are engaged in some deeper modeling right now to make sure that all of these projections still hold true, that the program that they're designing is as flexible as possible. But it does, the entire idea behind this model is that it would be flexible and it would change to changing circumstances. So, in addition to that flexibility, one of the great things about it is by getting all of these states to work together, you know, everyone is playing by the same established, transparent, market-based rules. There's not going to be any significant advantage from crossing a state line to buy your fuel there. And so by doing it all together, we're not pushing commerce or economic activity across any of the borders. And the last thing that I want to mention, one of the advantages of having it dynamically priced this way rather than something like a flat gas tax is it creates economic incentives in addition to just gaining the revenue, which is something like a gas tax would do. You know, fuel wholesalers can buy allowances if they keep selling the exact same type of fuel they're selling now, but they could also try to develop lower carbon fuel mixes that would allow them to buy fewer allowances and save money that way. Some of it may go on to the consumer, some of it they'd be able to work out throughout the rest of the supply market. But even more so, by creating these markets, by creating these incentives, it's going to push us towards technologies and solutions that we can't even anticipate right now. Yes, we know what some of them will be. It's going to be enhanced broadband. It's going to be better public transit. We'll talk about some of those down the road. But there's so many things that even 5 years ago we wouldn't have thought of. Scooter shares, the way we are looking at sharing streets now in a post-COVID world, are all possibilities that weren't anticipated a year or 2 years ago. And there will be more of those in the future as well. And this program will adapt to whatever technology and innovation and our changing circumstances allow. Next slide. So I think we've touched on this already. I'll just go through this really quickly, but this is what we are aiming to achieve with this structure, right? We're going to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. This is the climate change threat that we all know we're going to have to tackle. This is the biggest sector to deal with, and this is the most ambitious proposal that we have to deal with it. We're going to create a revenue stream that can invest in critical infrastructure that can improve public transit by encouraging mode shifting and different forms of transportation and broadband. We're going to alleviate congestion on the roads. We're going to reduce co-pollutants, which is going to improve public health. We'll be hearing a lot more about that from Dr. Tamala in a little bit. We're going to make the region more economically competitive because we're going to be more efficient in a key sector of our economy, which is going to drive economic growth and allow more resources for the rest of the priorities that we have. Next slide. Kathleen, I'll let you touch on the investment.
Great, thanks, John. One of the really fantastic things about the TCI program is that each state can really decide individually how to invest its share of the revenues, consistent with a statement of principles. So that means a state that's largely rural, as Maine is, can make different choices than a state that has a more heavily urban population and existing public transit systems. So we anticipate that any of the state requirements that states currently have in place for investment will apply to these revenues. That means in New York, for example, TCI investments would be guided by the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which requires investments in low and moderate income communities. In addition to the investments in public transit and passenger vehicle electrification, fleet electrification programs and broadband infrastructure investments have been highlighted as key areas for investment. Broadband is of particular interest here in Maine, where it's quite rural and we have quite limited broadband. And now so many of us are working from home, or in my case, outside a public library right now. Thank you for your patience with the background noise. We're also seeing demand for street space for biking and pedestrians to just absolutely skyrocket during the social distancing period. So we need a lot more resources to ensure public transportation funding is at a level that can really allow us to have healthy and safe upgrades and move essential workers around without overcrowding. Back to you, John.
Thanks, Kathleen. Next slide, please. Oh, so I do want to note, though, that this is not the end-all, be-all of our transportation problem solutions. This is going to create the incentives that we need. It's going to provide resources to all the states, but it can't do the job alone, and no one is saying that it can. Most immediately, we're going to need resources for our public transit system over the next year. We need to increase the availability so they're less crowded. It's going to take more resources so that we can clean and sanitize them. We're going to need to provide PPE for all of the workers on our transit system. And that's why we need something like the HEROES Act, which is in front of the Congress right now, and other stimulus efforts that are going to really help us in the short term. Other complementary policies, which might be able to get resources from TCI, but really are their own separate initiatives. Most of the states are going to have to pursue on their own. Is details of broadband build out, looking at ways of building more housing near transit, especially affordable housing. Establishing low or no emission zones in congested urban centers. We have companies that we work with that are trying to get zero emission delivery vehicles so that they'll be able to operate in these zones that we think are coming and we think need to come. And then looking at the example of California, they've adopted low carbon fuel standards under Section 177 of the Clean Air Act. And that's a policy that other states can join onto, and we encourage them to. And this is just a very, very short list. There are many more opportunities that states can and should be pursuing that we think TCI is a wonderful complement to. It's not an either or, they work together, and we fully support all of these moving forward as well. Next slide. So last note I wanted to make before I kick over to our featured speakers, who you really want to hear from, is the general timeline that we're looking at. So at the outset, I kind of gave you an overview of what happened in 2018 and 2019. The states have created a draft memorandum of understanding. They're still working on finalizing that. They're expecting to do that in fall of this year. As I mentioned, they're updating their modeling right now so they can get really detailed projections of how this program would work, especially in light of changing circumstances. So we're expecting some of that updated modeling in the next few months. In the fall, there would be a memorandum of understanding and a model rule. That's the legislation that, or executive orders that each state would have to adopt in order to put this into place. Every state needs to decide to join on their own. This isn't something that's imposed on the region. So what the states are doing right now is getting everything prepared so that each state will then be able to make those decisions next year. The goal of this all is to get everything into place and do the first emission allowance auction and revenue distribution in early 2022. So right now, that's the timeline. Beginning of 2022, this would actually start producing revenue and help us reduce emissions. Now, I do know some states are already looking at ways in which they can direct this funding should it come in 2022, and also potentially bonding ahead of expected revenue so that they might be able to use it sooner, given that we might be in the midst of an economic downturn, and any stimulus that could be brought to bear sooner would be very helpful. But that's a rough timeline. And with that, I'll pass it back to Ellie to introduce our featured speakers.
Thanks so much, John. And that was, I think, a really helpful overview for folks. And I hope the clear theme is that states' rights are alive and well, and that states can decide what they want to do and what that looks like. And we're excited to hear directly from one of those states. Secretary Strickler is here on video to my right. Hopefully you all are seeing it the same way I am. I know the video sometimes shows up differently, but on my screen, you're to my right. And Matt, we're thrilled to have you. I went over your bio at the front, and I'm going to unmute you now, and we'll kick it over to you to take it away.
Great. Thanks, Allie, for the introduction and for allowing me to participate today. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
Great, thanks. So again, I'm Matt Strickler. I'm the Secretary of Natural Resources in Virginia for Governor Ralph Northam, and my portfolio includes a wide variety of things, but certainly carbon emissions, clean energy, climate adaptation, all of those things that the TCI is central to are part of my portfolio. And I think it's important just to, if we can go to the next slide, to understand a little bit of the context on climate work in Virginia over the last few years, we're really in the midst of what's an historic transition for the Commonwealth. Our work to advance climate action and move forward on so many of these other issues is really proof positive of the fact that elections have consequences, and the Northam administration is now making up for lost time. It had Governor McAuliffe before him, and then certainly 2 governors ago, Governor Kane, were very serious about climate action and very interested in it, and unfortunately did not have partners in the General Assembly who were in power that were willing to work with them to make strides on climate policy. But last year we were able to get majorities in both the Senate and the House of Delegates in Virginia who were willing to work with Governor Northam and who are ambitious on climate action. So that's been really great, and that's certainly been a huge reason why, and probably the biggest reason why, in addition to Governor Northam's leadership, why we've really been able to accelerate climate action in Virginia. So over the past couple of years, we've made a ton of progress that I'll just outline really quickly for you. First, the governor announced earlier today that Virginia will, as of January 1st, 2021, be a full participant in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in RGGI. We've signed our regulation in the Commonwealth to allow participation, and we'll be going through the rest of the administrative process with the ability to participate in our first RGGI auction in probably March, early spring of 2021. So that's huge for Virginia, right? I mean, it's we've got it set up so that through legislation that the General Assembly passed and the governor signed, to allow about half of the revenue that we generate through those auctions, a projected $50 million a year, to go towards low-income energy efficiency projects. So it's something that will help with climate mitigation and also some of the equity concerns that some have talked about around RGGI. And then 45% of the funding will go to the Community Flood Preparedness Fund, which is a statewide initiative that will allow for the Commonwealth to really put some skin in the game in helping communities deal with the impacts of climate change on a flooding, inland flooding and coastal resilience perspective. In addition to that legislation, the General Assembly also passed the Virginia Clean Economy Act, which was kind of the legislative companion to Governor Northam's executive order last fall, putting in place a 100% clean energy mandate for the electric power sector that'll will go into place by no later than 2050. So that's huge. We join a small handful of states that have a standard like that. We've got our first federal offshore wind project getting stood up in federal waters. As a matter of fact, the governor and I believe, are going to be going out on Monday to see progress on that project. We're looking at potentially 5,200 megawatts of offshore wind by 2034 through that initiative, working with Dominion Energy and Orsted and others. And we've been working on our coastal resilience master plan as well. The governor hired a special assistant for coastal adaptation and protection, a U.S. Navy retired Rear Admiral Ann Phillips, who has been really plugged into climate mitigation and adaptation work on the federal level and on her in her hometown of Norfolk, Virginia, on the local level. So she's been doing great things and working to put in place a really strong resilience program for the Commonwealth. So a lot of good science going on at Virginia Institute of Marine Science and other places. Old Dominion University working on predictive modeling and things like that to support those efforts. And we've got a lot of good progress there. Where we are admittedly lagging behind is in the transportation sector. We've got a lot of work to do there. Frankly, we are a little bit behind on our state fleet. We could make a lot of progress there with bringing electric vehicles into the state fleet. And certainly we want to look at other opportunities as well to clean up the transportation sector. We've spent a significant amount of our Volkswagen Dieselgate settlement funding on clean transportation, building out our electric vehicle charging backbone, putting a significant amount of money into electric school buses and electric transit buses in some of our most heavily populated regions with high social vulnerability. So those are really good initiatives, and we're looking to do more with that. But long term, we need some bigger solutions. And if we can go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about Virginia's perspective on TCI. So you can see here, and this is not dissimilar to other regions in the country, but Virginia has now at this point, with the progress we've made in our electric sector, the majority or plurality and the significant share of our emissions are coming from the transportation sector. And we've got a lot of work to do there, and it's decentralized, as you all know. There's some big systemic challenges. The Northeast and kind of Mid-Atlantic region, which we're a part of, in the I-95 corridor, very vehicle heavy, a lot of traffic and a lot of economic activity that depends on that. And we really have to, have a paradigm shift in the way that we get around and that we transport people and goods. And there are other challenges as well, as you all know. Funding is down as cars become more efficient and gas tax revenue falls. We've got a lot of folks who are spending too much time stuck in traffic. Land use patterns that have built up around highways and road infrastructure not only have created and kind of locked us into an unsustainable transportation pattern, but have also disproportionately impacted minority and low income communities. And that's something that we absolutely need to try to address through TCI as well. And in addition to being a huge emitter and our top emitter of carbon pollution, transportation is responsible for a lot of the other pollutants that are a detriment to public health, especially in our urban areas. And that's something that we want to make sure that we're addressing just generally from a public health standpoint, but particularly from an equity standpoint as well. So the regional policy that's being developed through TCI that Virginia has been at the table for and working diligently on the development of, and particularly I just want to give a shout out to our Deputy Director of the Department of Environmental Quality, Chris Bath, who has been working really hard and been kind of our point person on Reggie. Chris has been doing amazing work, a really thoughtful, smart guy, and is doing a great job making sure Virginia's plugged in there and that we're staying on track to kind of evaluate what comes forward as far as the draft MOU and things like that, and get a good response and good policy prescriptions come out of the Commonwealth. Let's go to the next slide. Don't want to spend a ton of time here because I don't want to take away from the next presentation, but it's certainly important, I think, particularly with in the midst of the global COVID-19 pandemic, to talk about environmental justice and how important that is, and the public health impacts of the transportation sector. I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but Governor Northam, being a doctor and in particular a pediatrician, certainly understands what air pollution does to young lungs, and particularly the lungs of folks who live in urban areas in Virginia. We want to make sure that as we're thinking through kind of the outcomes and changes that we make on the public health side with respect to equity and kind of subsequent General Assembly action and executive action, thinking through what the pandemic's impacts are, we certainly want to be mindful of transportation and things that we can do to reduce chronic disease, and investing in programs that reduce pollution and create kind of a cleaner economy and a cleaner place for folks to live and work and play, while also growing the economy in the traditional sense, but also in the sense of fostering new growth in new industries that are related to electric vehicles, transit. Broadband has been mentioned. We have a very significant broadband initiative. So a lot of opportunities there to kind of bind together things like community resilience, dealing with chronic health issues, and then of course the equity issues all surrounding transportation pollution. Next slide, please. So we know in Virginia, through particularly our participation in the Chesapeake Bay program, that regional initiatives like this can be really constructive vehicles and fora for getting things done. I mentioned our participation in Reggie and certainly the value of regional collaboration there, and a way to grow the economy and to get some good programs on the ground. So we're excited about the opportunity to move forward with TCI. I think we've interestingly got a pretty good head start on this in Virginia. Last General Assembly session, the governor introduced and the General Assembly passed a significant increase to Virginia's gas tax, which is going to be part of our solution to this problem. It's a 5-cent increase over 2 years, and the gas tax will be indexed to inflation after that. That's going to fund a governor's initiative that will invest about $370 million in mass transit, in improving metro, in regional buses and infrastructure to support more sustainable transportation solutions. So that's really exciting. It's something that we're working hard on, and it's kind of initially the centerpiece of what we're putting forward in Virginia is how we're gonna make TCI work and kind of highlight for people the important benefits of the program. Let me go to the next slide. So I think the last thing I'd like to talk about a little bit is just how we get from where we are to where we want to be in a state like Virginia. We spent a lot of time, and it was a lot of effort, excuse me, to get to a point where we could join RGGI. Certainly having a cooperative legislature helped, but it's also about education. It took a lot of work to get people to understand what RGGI is, get them to be comfortable with it, help them understand that it wouldn't have disproportionate impacts on people who are on fixed incomes. And we got the same questions around TCI, except that we haven't been socializing TCI with the state legislature for 4 years. So certainly, as you all can imagine, from some well-heeled interests, there's a lot of misinformation going around about what TCI would look like and what it would mean for people, particularly, low-income individuals and their pocketbooks. We're doing our best to push back on that, but certainly having folks like the members of Series and others contacting our state legislators, particularly folks in positions of leadership, helping them be comfortable with TCI, understanding the benefits it has for their communities. Those are really the things that we've got to lean in on hard in the next few months, in addition to going through the technical exercises of getting the MOU language right and drafting legislation and things like that. So that would be kind of my ask to the folks who are participating in this call and who are interested in seeing TCI move forward, and Virginia being a part of that. You know, the governor can put things forward, but we will, at the end of the day, have to have legislation in order to kind of join the club and get some of these good policies and good work on the ground. So really need everybody's help on that, and certainly have gotten some supportive letters from folks, and that's really good. It's good for the governor and his policy team to hear that support coming in, so that they know really what we're talking about when we start having serious conversations in advance of the next General Assembly session. But really need to help find some champions in the Virginia General Assembly and folks who are going to be comfortable talking about this in contentious committee hearings and on the floor of those chambers, and willing to put in the work to get it done. So that's pretty much what I've got. I will stand by for questions if anybody has them, and thanks again for having me today.
Thank you so much, Secretary Strickler. And we've gotten some good questions coming in, including 2 reminders that our RGGI map was out of date because it didn't include Virginia, which means we've got to update our slides, which obviously we knew that Virginia had joined RGGI and we were very much a part of that advocacy, but glad to know that the map is out of date, and hopefully it will continue to be out of date as other states around the country will consider joining. So that's a good problem, but we will certainly fix it. So thank you to folks who wrote in about that. We also got one quick question just around slides and recording, and all of that will be shared. And then Secretary Strickler, we just had a question for you about one question that quickly came in, and then we can do more at the end, but around the regionalization and regional coordination, how that has worked for RGGI and how that helped Virginia potentially make that decision a little easier from a cost standpoint, and how that's a potential consideration around how you all tackle transportation emissions, because Virginia is certainly not alone in this being the largest sector that folks need to tackle.
So it's definitely a great question. I mentioned, Virginia is no stranger to heavy lifts on the regional collaboration front. So I think strength in numbers is very important. And also proof of concept. I mean, one of the things that helped us a lot with Reggie was being able to tell legislators that we needed to get votes from that, look, this has provided significant benefits in the other states that have adopted it, both in terms of reducing carbon emissions, but also in providing revenue for the kinds of programs that that will not only drive down pollution, but also provide benefits, tangible benefits to folks who live in these legislators' districts. So, being able to show that, we're getting significant investments in some states in, low-income weatherization programs, public transportation, those types of things. So it's coastal resilience is another good example. So we were able to kind of use that as a selling point, and I think we can, even though states are kind of all trying to move forward together at this time on TCI, we'll be able to look at the Reggie model, and even if things turn out to be a little bit different with the way TCI gets implemented and rolled out, we can say there's proof of concept, and I think that's a really important thing.
Excellent. And then we'll do one more question that came in, and then we'll move over to Dr. Tumala in the interest of time. But there was a quick question just around how the COVID pandemic has affected TCI work and the states delaying that process and probably using this time to really do additional listening sessions, but curious how COVID has impacted Virginia in your climate goals, but then also the regional coordination between the states.
Sure, thanks for that question. The pandemic has been challenging for a lot of reasons on the Commonwealth and about with the initiatives we're trying to move forward on. This one, as you mentioned, doing outreach, doing listening sessions. This is kind of a suboptimal environment for those types of things, but at the same time, we've been kind of getting geared up for that, and also continuing to meet and talk with the other TCI states about kind of again getting our ducks in a row for a legislative push on this in the fall and going into the winter. So work is definitely continuing. Again, there's some challenges and some delays there, but we're optimistic that we'll have something to put together for General Assembly consideration in the next General Assembly session.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Secretary Strickler, and we'll aim to come back to you in the Q&A. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tumala to talk a little bit about the public health impacts of tackling climate change and TCI as a solution in that toolbox. Oh, Nilu, I think we just need to unmute you. I apologize, or you may need to unmute yourself.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yep. Yes.
Perfect.
Sorry.
Thank you for that introduction. And John and Kathleen, thank you for that overview of TCI. And obviously, Secretary Strickler, it's great to hear that public health is so important to Virginia. So I'm Neely Tumala, and I'm going to be talking today about why initiatives that focus on decreasing levels of particulate matter in the air are so important to public health. Next slide, please. Patients are becoming the human face of the climate crisis. This quotation by Dr. Renee Salas, an ER physician in Boston, could not be more true. Clinicians such as myself increasingly see the health effects of the climate crisis in their patients, whether it's young, healthy patients showing up with acute kidney failure during summer heat waves, patients enduring longer allergy symptoms, or seeing increased rates of mental health concerns in the wake of intensified natural disasters. I actually had a patient a few weeks ago that I hadn't seen in a while because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I joked with him about how he was handling staying cooped inside in order to minimize his chance of exposure. And he responded with, "Doc, what do you mean a few weeks? I have been doing this for years." I learned that he lives near a highway, and he said that the air pollution over the last several years was aggravating his asthma and causing too many breathing issues, that he found it easier to stay indoors, protected from the outside air. So when you hear from patients like this who are directly suffering from ambient air pollution, it is easy to understand why particulate matter is such a concerning issue of public health. Next slide, please. Transportation, as we have heard, is a major source of carbon emissions, but also of air pollutants. TRAP, also known as traffic-related air pollution, has several components, including nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter. Particulate matter is often subcategorized based on the size of the particle, and two we will be mentioning are PM 2.5 and PM 10, which are 2.5 micrometers and 10 micrometers in size, respectively. Next slide, please. So this is a simple schematic of a young boy. Let's call him Alok. When Alok takes a breath, the air travels through his nose or his mouth, down his airway, into the trachea, and into one of the lobes of his lungs. So when Alok breathes nitrogen dioxide, which is increasingly being recognized as an important indoor and outdoor pollutant generated by automobiles, his lung function is affected by these particles that enter his airway. Specifically, his lung function is reduced. One study found that for every 10 parts per billion increase in classroom nitrogen dioxide concentration, there was a 5% reduction in an important lung function test known as the FEV1-FVC ratio. Similarly, sulfur dioxide exposure has also been linked to reduced lung function and an increased rate of asthma-related emergency department visits. Next slide, please. So when we talk about particulate matter, again, the size of the particulate matter is important, wherein smaller particles often pose a greater risk than larger ones. So in this picture on the left, you can see the size of a standard human hair is about 50 to 70 microns. And comparatively, PM10 and PM2.5 are much smaller particles. So when the slightly older lady, let's call her Maya, breathes in TRAP, the tiniest particles, which are 2.5 microns and smaller, travel through her nose, down her airway, and into the lungs. But this time, they are able to travel farther along the branching bronchi of the lungs into the bronchioles and reach the alveoli of the lungs. The membrane of the alveoli is incredibly thin, sometimes just a cell layer thick, because that is where gas exchange occurs. Oxygen is exchanged for carbon dioxide in the blood. So when Maya has these tiny particles settling into her airway, they can cause inflammation and oxidative stress, basically leading to airway injury, which can lead to breathing issues by exacerbating chronic inflammatory conditions such as asthma and COPD, which is an obstructive lung disease. And the tiniest of these particles, usually less than 1 micron, can even irritate and erode through the walls of the alveoli and enter the bloodstream through the capillaries. Next slide, please. So really briefly, I'm going to touch on how PM 2.5 affects a few different populations, children, pregnant women, and marginalized communities by using some well-designed review papers. Next slide, please. So children and PM 2.5. Children are one of the most vulnerable populations to the effects of particulate matter, specifically children with asthma, one of the most chronic illnesses of childhood, affecting over 6 million US children. This review paper looked at 41 studies and found significant associations between asthma onset and the exposure to nitrogen dioxide, PM10, and especially PM2.5. So basically, this review paper showed that childhood exposure to TRAP, traffic-related air pollution, contributes to the development of asthma. Next slide, please. Pregnancy and PM 2.5. So this review came out last week, and it might look very familiar to a lot of you. This review showed that exposure to PM 2.5 or ozone was associated with increased risk of preterm birth in 80% of studies and with low birth rate infants in 86% of studies. It also showed that populations highest at risk were persons with asthma and minority groups, especially Black mothers. The main author, Dr. Jay Nicola, my colleague at George Washington University, quoted in the New York Times article, "This really does set the stage for an entire generation." What he means is the effects of air pollution exposure, premature birth, and low birth weight can have consequences that last a lifetime, affecting such things as brain development and vulnerability to disease. Next slide, please. So Marginalized Communities and Pm 2.5. So this final study, published in June 2017, studied a Medicare population from 2000 to 2012. Basically, they evaluated the mortality rate related to annual exposure to PM 2.5. Next slide, please. What they found was that in general, a lower socioeconomic status and more minorities had a higher estimated risk of death from any cause in association with PM 2.5 exposure as compared to the general population. So let's break that down a little bit. The dotted line represents the overall population. I want to have you click once. If you don't mind clicking for the next. Perfect. And the red box in the middle shows a higher death rate for Hispanics and Asians. But what is most concerning, if you don't mind clicking one more time. Perfect. Is the death rate for Black Americans, highlighted with the red arrow, which was 3 times as high as that for the overall population. Next slide, please. This is the same graphic, and what I'm highlighting, we'll go back one. Perfect. This is the same graphic, and what I'm highlighting here is that persons who are eligible for Medicaid, so i.e. those who have low socioeconomic status, also had a higher estimated risk of death in association with PM 2.5 exposure than the general population. Next slide, please. So the question is, does cleaner air mean better health? This is a longitudinal study published in JAMA of over 4,100 children in Southern California who were followed over a 10-year period from 1993 to 2014, 20-year period. The 2 graphics on the left show the relative decrease in nitrogen dioxide on the top and PM 2.5 on the bottom over this period. And you can see that the relative slope downwards is essentially because of stricter regulation. So basically there was less nitrogen dioxide and PM 2.5 over this period. The different colors just represent different regions that were looked at. Next slide, please. So on the right, we now see 2 graphs which show the incidence of childhood asthma over this period. So to summarize the significant findings, on the top, a decline in nitrogen dioxide was significantly associated with lower childhood asthma incidence. And on the bottom, a decline in PM 2.5 was also significantly associated with lower childhood asthma incidence. So yes, cleaner air leads to better health. In this case, fewer children with asthma. Next slide, please. So I'm going to finish up with a few words about COVID-19, an ongoing public health crisis that also affects all of us. So this study is out of Harvard, and it is undergoing peer review, but the findings are too substantial to not at least mention it. This nationwide cross-sectional study found an association between air pollution exposure over many years and death from COVID-19. For every 1 microgram per cubic meter increase in air pollution, it was associated with an 8% increase in mortality from COVID-19 infection. For comparison, many Americans breathe air with about 8 micrograms per cubic meter of particulate matter. So, as the COVID death rate surpasses 121,000, and considering how much racial disparity the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted, with an overall mortality rate for Black Americans that is 2.4 times as high as white Americans, we cannot ignore these public health crises. Next slide, please. Here's a few take-home thoughts. Clean air is obviously important for health, and particulate matter is a huge public health concern. So TCI is a thoughtful plan. It is rooted in regional collaboration and has the capacity to decrease particulate matter level and the potential to really improve public health. Next slide, please. So thank you all. Feel free to reach out to me via Twitter with any questions, concerns, or comments.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Chamala. And there are so many questions coming in on the chat. I fear that we're not going to be able to get to all of these. But I wanted to just start with one question that came in for you, which was around your role as a member of the public health community in policy advocacy, and why are you particularly involved in this work, but then also what are you seeing among your peers in this space, and both at the federal and at the state level.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. So probably about 10 years ago, I didn't know much about the health effects of particulate matter, but now I do. And that is in huge thanks to important research that has been done to really identify what the specific health concerns are, but also how huge of a public health issue this is. And so I find it incredibly important for healthcare professionals to be speaking up on this issue, both because, as I mentioned in my talk, we are seeing the consequences of the climate crisis in our patients, and also because it's part of our job to protect the well-being and the health of our patients, which is basically everyone. So I have been fortunate, as I have been talking more and more about the public health concerns of the climate crisis, to meet other colleagues who are doing similar work. I am a member of the Virginia Clinicians for Climate Action, and the Medical Society Consortium for Climate and Health is a huge consortium of multiple medical groups who are really have joined together, and they're out of George Mason University to really talk about and highlight the issues surrounding the climate crisis and how this affects our patients. So it is something where a lot more healthcare professionals need to step up on and talk more about, but there's definitely been a lot of movement and a lot of recognition within the healthcare sector in terms of speaking up about this.
Great. Well, there was also a question around for you, Dr. Tummala, about the negative outcomes of air pollution for lower income individuals and people of color. And just curious as if there's a prioritization from a policy standpoint that you see that there were some marginal differences between people of color versus low income in being on the front lines. And in policy design, do you have recommendations about how we should address those challenges?
I think that, environmental injustice is such a huge issue, and I think it's one that is gaining a lot of traction right now. And I think that a lot of, activists who talk about the climate crisis recognize that climate issues affect everyone, but may only now be appreciating how much it affects certain populations. And so I think that us speaking up about it and educating the public as a whole and making sure that when policy is being made, that they focus on these communities, the communities that my patients often live in, and that most of the work is done there because they're the ones that need the most help. And I think it's really just about prioritizing the areas that are the most vulnerable and that we're seeing the most intense health effects from.
Great. For you, Secretary Strickler, there was a question about how do we ensure that when fuel producers pass a potential cost onto customers that it doesn't have a disproportionate effect on low income and at-risk communities? What are, probably this is an investment question about how those investments are used, but also there were some questions that came in around the recent gas tax increase in Virginia, and will any of those funds also help support public transit and other solutions outside of roads and bridges? So a two-part question for you.
Sure. So to answer the second part first, the answer is yes. The governor has a very ambitious public transit, mass transit agenda that will be supported by the gas tax increase. So we're talking about replacing Long Bridge over the Potomac River, which is one of the most heavily traveled rail bridges in the country. We're talking about upgrades to Metro. We're talking about upgrades to regional transit systems outside of the DC metro area, including bus systems in Hampton Roads, Richmond, and in the Blacksburg area. So, we've got a lot of good initiatives there that are not just focused on pouring concrete and supporting cars. I've got a great partnership with Shannon Valentine, who's our Secretary of Transportation. She and her team get it. They know that this is not a sustainable way to move people around in the long term, both because of the environmental impacts and because of the unsustainability of funding sources like the gas tax. So, we're going to have to figure out ways to be creative and think about other ways to fund transportation. But TCI is, I think, a really important step and a really good bridge. And the General Assembly is ultimately going to have to make the decisions on how any revenue gets spent. We'll certainly be working to put together a proposal that is equitable, that does not disproportionately impact low-income residents, and that also tries to create equity in the benefits and make up for some the fact that we're behind in doing that and providing resources that that many of those communities can take advantage of. So look forward to working with the General Assembly on those things. And I guess the important part about a carbon price, and that's basically what we're talking about here, is that we don't really want folks to pay for it. We want folks to change their behavior, and so we want to make getting around without using gasoline and without using diesel more affordable. And the way that you do that is by investing some of the proceeds from a TCI or RGGI type program into things that have immediate benefits for people who are bearing disproportionate burdens, but also investing in the infrastructure and getting to the economies of scale for sustainable transportation and clean transportation that allow the costs to come down relative to the system that we have now. So a lot of things to still work on, a lot of questions to still be answered, but we're looking forward to sifting through those with the rest of the TCI states.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's a perfect way to end, and I apologize that there are so many more questions in the chat and we weren't able to answer them, but that's always a good sign of a good discussion. And I think hopefully this is really the beginning of a lot of conversations. As Secretary Strickler said, this is going to go to the states, and then the states are going to bring it to their legislatures about how to spend those revenues. So there are many opportunities for engagement and ensuring that frontline communities, people of color, et cetera, are really considered in how we design this program to both reduce emissions, but then also ensure that we're coming up with equitable transportation solutions that empower people and get them to work and keep their families safe and healthy, which are, I think, all of the goals that we all share. So thank you to our incredible speakers for joining us, and to all of our participants. And I think another important takeaway from the Secretary was that we just need people to engage in the process. So we need doctors like Dr. Tumala, who are sharing their expertise and really teaching us about the important public health implications, but also advocates, businesses, et cetera, really sharing and engaging in the process. So hopefully for those of you who've joined us, you'll continue to do that. And thanks so much for so many of you for sticking with us 2 minutes past the hour, and to John and Kathleen for your insights on TCI. So thanks so much, and have a lovely rest of your afternoon. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Allie. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.